Okay, we finished up part one of the causes of the Civil War. We're going to take a look at part two, but again, keeping in mind that what we have found, again, are a series of events, each one adding more and more pressure to each section of the country to, let's put it very simply, to get its way, if you will. The split between North and South was widening. The Band-Aid approaches that had tried to hold that split together, namely the Missouri Compromise, then the Compromise of 1850, were not strong enough to heal that wound. And so now, each event that was taking place after that, we ended with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively ended the concept of the Missouri Compromise. Because if you remember, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was relying on popular sovereignty, that the people should get to vote on what's going to happen. So now we're entering the year 1854. And by that time, the feelings on both sides of the issue had started to become entrenched. Political parties were losing their grips in maintaining discipline. And by that, we're referring to the idea that if you were let's say, a Democrat, then regardless of how you felt personally or what your section believed in, if the Democratic Party put up a candidate or a platform, then all Democrats, regardless of geographic section, would vote for that. That was starting to go by the wayside. So parties were losing control in that respect. So we're going to take a look at some of the other events that took place, leading us all the way up to Fort Sumter. Okay, so causes of the Civil War, part two. 1854 will find the incident involving the Ostend Manifesto. Now, just to backtrack, what was happening was that we were attempting to buy the island of Cuba. And of course, automatically, Cuba we turned into a slave state. We had sent a negotiating team over to Ostend, Belgium, to try to work something out. The leader of that group that we had sent over there was a future president of the United States by the name of James Buchanan, who came from Pennsylvania. Again, most Pennsylvanians were abolitionists or at least anti-slavery as such, but not Buchanan. Buchanan sends a note back to the president, who at that time, remember, was Franklin Pierce, suggesting that if Spain will not sell Cuba, then we should take it. In other words, go to war. So when this leaks out, this, of course, just justifies all the fears of Northerners from the time of the Mexican-American War, which we felt was a war. When I say we, we're talking about the North now, was a war to extend slavery, which it was not totally, but obviously that entered into it. But this was pure proof that another war would do that very thing. All of this was going to lead to the formation of the Republican Party. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, with the advent of the Ostend Manifesto, you're going to have the Republican Party make its debut on the American political stage. But I don't want you to think that they were the only party. Listen to this. These were all the parties that were involved in 1854 in the United States. You have obviously the Democrats, what's left over from the Whigs, and the Free Soilers. And now you had the People's Party, anti-Nebraskaites, fusionists, know-nothings, know-somethings, Maine Lawites, temperance, rum Democrats, silver-gray Whigs, Hindus, hard-shell Democrats, soft-shell Democrats, half-shell Democrats, etc. All those were some of the political parties that were in existence at that time. So this was, as you can tell, a rather confusing political landscape. And enter now the Republican Party. They were a compendium, if you will, of various groups that had something in common, namely some opposition to slavery. The Republican Party was based solely on one issue, and that was to stop the expansion of slavery. So you're going to have some abolitionists join it, members of the Know Nothing Party. That's the party we talked about before, who would run a presidential candidate in 1856. The former president of the United States, Millard Fillmore. The Know Nothing Party was basically anti-immigrant, but anti-immigrant and anti-slave had some sort in common. You have Whigs who are going to join, former Whigs. You have Democrats who will join the Republican Party. The reason being they were opposed to the expansion of slavery. And then members of the Free Soil Party. Former President Martin Van Buren from New York, again, against the expansion of slavery. So it was that one thread that pulled all these together. But again, it doesn't mean that they were all abolitionists, because they were not. It doesn't mean that they believed in equality for African Americans in the country, because most of them, with notable exceptions, did not. So we have the election of 1856. And in this election, the Republicans will nominate their very first presidential candidate. And that, of course, will be Fremont. Fremont, of course, had been a hero of the Mexican-American War, securing California for the United States. Fremont had a rather, let's say, lilting campaign slogan. It was free land, free men, Fremont. Kind of gets you, doesn't it? Anyway, as you can see, Fremont barely loses to Buchanan. He loses, and again, we're talking about a brand new political party. And this party showed that if they could get everybody, as you see at the bottom of the screen, in their party to vote together, then the South would lose out in the next election. Buchanan was acceptable to the South because he espoused a theory of non-interference with state matters. Now, the next event that's going to push the snowball closer to rolling down the hill would be an attack on the floor of the United States Senate. Charles Sumner, senator from the state of Massachusetts. Sumner will give a speech chastising South Carolina in particular, but a couple of individuals who once again used that old tire tactic of threatening secession. The next day, while Sumner was sitting at his desk in the Senate, a congressman, a representative from South Carolina by the name of Preston Brooks, comes up from behind him, takes out his cane, and starts beating the bejesus out of Sumner. Sumner was stuck in his chair, couldn't get out from underneath the desk, and while some of the Senate stood and cheered what Brooks was doing, Sumner was gravely injured. He would suffer massive head injuries, which would keep him out of the public eye for some time. However, he will be back, as you'll see. Sumner does not press charges. Brooks will be expelled from the Senate. He will be sent by admirers throughout the South. He will be sent thousands of new canes to take the place. And of course, the old cane was broken up into splinters and sold as memorabilia from this famous attack. By this time, you are a fool if you are a senator or a congressman and did not carry a gun into session. That's how dangerous everything had got. You take a look at what just happened in Michigan when armed individuals walked into the State House in Michigan and basically closed down the state government for a while. Now, the next And one of the biggest problems that's going to be faced will be the problem involving Dred Scott. Dred Scott was a slave who was owned by a Missouri citizen who happened to be a doctor in the United States Army. That doctor was transferred to the Minnesota Territory, which was free. Northwest Ordinance, of course, had forbidden slavery in that area going back to before the Constitution. Scott was there for 2 years. During that time, he marries a woman, and they will have a daughter, again, while up in Minnesota. When Scott is moved back to Missouri and his owner dies, Scott, with some direction and some help, is going to sue for his freedom. And of course, he claims he should be free because he was in a territory which forbade slavery for 2 years. His wife should be free for the same reason, and their daughter, who was born in that territory, should most definitely be free. This is going to go to the Missouri State Supreme Court, and then eventually all the way to the United States Supreme Court. Now, keep in mind that the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court was Roger Taney. Taney is the same individual who obeyed the dictates of Andrew Jackson when he fired Treasury Secretary after Treasury Secretary, trying to get them to starve the Bank of the United States by pulling out United States funds from the bank. Taney did it, and as his reward, he would be appointed as Chief Justice to the United States Supreme Court. Taney, of course, is a Southerner. And as a matter of fact, 6 of the 9 old men are Southern slaveholders. So Taney decided to expand the case, not just in deciding whether Dred Scott was free or not, but he was going to answer a number of questions, thinking that the Supreme Court, with its prestige garnered for it by, of course, Chief Justice John Marshall, thinking that the prestige would be able for once and for all solve the problem of slavery. So the following questions would be answered. Could a Black person even be a citizen in the United States? Was the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional? So Roger Taney, one of the 6 judges who were pro-slave, all right, once and for all, was going to attempt to solve this problem. The decision would be as follows. The Missouri Compromise, unconstitutional. Why? Because you cannot deal unfairly with a man's property. Fifth Amendment to the Constitution says that you have the right to due process of law to lose your property. So essentially what he was saying was that neither Congress nor a state could rule slavery unconstitutional. It had to be by vote of the people. Dred Scott is not free. And why is Dred Scott not free? Because he's not a citizen. And he expanded this. He said a Black man, despite whether being free or slave, could never be a citizen of the United States. And if you're not a citizen, this is why Dred Scott was not free, you did not have what's called standing or a right to bring a case before the United States Supreme Court. That's reserved strictly for citizens. So those were the 4 dictates that come from Chief Justice Roger Taney. Take a look here on the screen as to what Taney had to say about the rights of African Americans in this country. And essentially, he says, for more than a century, they are being regarded as an inferior order, altogether unfit to associate with the white race, and so far inferior that they had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. This opinion was at the time fixed and universal in the civilized portion of the white race. So with the Dred Scott decision, there was absolutely no grounds for compromise. It was either this way or no way. Following on the heels of this will be the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Stephen A. Douglas, the little giant. Douglas, of course, if you remember, was the one that had taken the Kansas-Nebraska Act and essentially did away with the right of the state and the right of Congress to control the territories. Now, he's running again for Senate in state of Illinois. Keep in mind, back in those days, the people did not vote for the United States Senate. That was voted for by the state legislatures. So instead of 5 million people casting their ballots, you may have just 50. Douglas was a Democrat. The legislature in Illinois was largely Democrat, but he would be challenged by Abraham Lincoln, a Springfield, Illinois lawyer, a former member of the Whig Party, now joins the Republican Party. And Lincoln challenges Douglas to a series of debates. Douglas didn't have to accept. The election was in the bag. But nonetheless, he accepts, and he and Lincoln will hold a series of debates throughout the length and breadth of the Illinois territory. These two will engage in approximately 5 or 6 debates. And the most famous was the one that took place in Freeport, Illinois. Lincoln puts Douglas on the horns of a dilemma. He says, you're a United States Senator. Do you support the Supreme Court and the Dred Scott decision? Well, of course, if he said no, then he flies in the face of legal opinion number one, but more importantly, he would fly in the face of Southern support in his eventual bid for the presidency. On the other hand, Douglas tries to nimbly dance around it. He says, I support the Dred Scott decision, but, and this was an important but, I also maintain that if a state is not in agreement with it, then the state who would have to enforce the Dred Scott decision could pass laws making it virtually impossible to enforce it without violating it. This becomes known as the Freeport Doctrine. As you see there, the territories could still determine the existence of slavery through unfriendly legislation. This, of course, was going to really fly in the face of Southerners. And there they saw, again, a Northerner attempting to evade the powers that be. Now, the two of them would debate one more time in the capital of Illinois, Springfield. And in that debate, Lincoln is going to utter a famous phrase that's going to vault him into national prominence. So let's take a look. Maybe. We have a glitch here. Stay patient. We'll get it. This is that to be.
Let each state mind its own business and leave its neighbors alone. If we'll stand on that principle, then Mr. Lincoln will find that this great republic can exist, forever divided into free and slave states, and we can go on, as we have done, increasing in wealth, in population, in power, until we shall become the admiration and the terror of the world.
Listen to them yell, the empty-headed idiots yelling at empty words. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He never did.
You upset me, Drake.
Mr. Abraham Lincoln.
Don't get him, Ed!
Judge Douglas has paid tribute to my skill with the dagger. I thank him for that, but I must admit that he can do more with that weapon than I can. He can keep 10 daggers flashing in the air at the same time. Fortunately, he's so good at it that none of the knives ever falls and hurts anyone. Now, you've heard the judge make allusion to those who advocate voting and eating and marrying and sleeping with Negroes. Whether he meant me specifically, I do not know. If he did, I can only say that just because I do not want a colored woman for a slave, I do not necessarily want her for a wife. I do not need to have her for either. I can just leave her alone. In some respects, she is certainly not my equal any more than I am the judge's equal in some respects. But in her natural right to eat the bread she earns with her own hands without asking leave of somebody else, she is my equal and the equal of all others. Now, you heard the judge speak about our own labor conditions. As an American, I cannot be proud that such conditions exist. But as an American, I can ask, would any of the striking workers in the North elect to change places with the slaves in the South? Will they not rather say the remedy is in our hands, and still as an American, I can say, thank God we live under a system by which men have the right to strike. I am not preaching rebellion. I don't have to. This country with its institutions belongs to the people who inhabit it. Whenever they shall grow weary of the existing government, they can exercise their constitutional right of amending it, or their revolutionary right to dismember or overthrow it. If the Founding Fathers gave us anything, they gave us that. The purpose of the Dred Scott decision is to make property and nothing but property of the Negro in all states of the Union. It is the old issue of human rights versus property rights. It is the eternal struggle between two principles. The one, the common right of humanity. The other, the divine right of kings. It is the same spirit which says you toil and work and earn bread and I'll eat it. As a nation, we began by declaring all men are created equal. There was no mention of any exception to that rule in the Declaration of Independence. But we now practically read it, all men are created equal except Negroes. If we are to accept this doctrine of race or class discrimination, what is to stop us in future from decreeing all men are created equal except Negroes, foreigners, Catholics, Jews, or just poor people? That is the conclusion towards which the advocates of slavery are driving us. Let each state mind its own business, says Judge Douglas. Why stir up trouble? This is the complacent policy of indifference to evil. And that policy I cannot but hate. I hate it because of the monstrous injustice of slavery itself. I hate it because it deprives our republic of its just influence in the world, enables the enemies of free institutions everywhere to taunt us as hypocrites, causes the real friends of freedom to doubt our sincerity, and especially because it forces so many good men among ourselves into an open war with the very fundamentals of civil liberty, denying the good faith of the Declaration of Independence and insisting that there is no right principle of action but self-interest. In his final words tonight, the judge said that we can be the terror of the world. I don't think we want to be that. I think we would prefer to be the encouragement of the world, the proof that at last man is worthy to be free. But we shall provide no such encouragement unless we can establish our ability as a nation to live and grow. And we shall surely do neither if these states fail to remain united. There can be no distinction in the definition of liberty as between one section and another, one class and another, one race and another. A house divided against itself cannot stand. This government cannot endure permanently, half slave and half free.
Now, keep in mind, at this particular point in time in American history, we were undergoing a depression. You have 40%, and in some cases it's 60% of individuals who are of working age out of work. In New York City alone, you had over 100,000 people lose their jobs in 1 year. All this, of course, sounds very familiar. So that's why Lincoln keeps drawing the parallels between the worker and the slave. The House divided speech is going to make him a national name. And in the South, it makes him a pariah because it sounds like he wants to do away with slavery. What he says is he hates slavery, does not want to see it expanded, but he never comes out and says he'll do away with slavery. Now, the next event that's going to take place comes right on the heels. And it's another slave revolt. But this time, slightly different. It will be led by a white man. This man, John Brown. John Brown, famous because of his actions taken in Kansas. If we had the time, we'd take a look at John Brown's background. Absolutely fascinating. He's a man who failed at everything he did in life, except hate slavery. He was raised on the Bible, and he followed the Bible, hated the Constitution, believed in the Declaration of Independence and in the Bible, but not the Constitution. His plan, John Brown of Osawatomie, Kansas, is with some of his kids. He had 20 of them.
I'll be back.
Was to go to Massachusetts. He visits with a group that will be nicknamed the Secret Six, and there he will get monetary support. What he wanted to do, as you see at the bottom there, was lead a slave revolt by raising an army of freed slaves, with, of course, him at its head. And to arm them, they were going to go right there. That, of course, is in West Virginia. And that, of course, is where a United States Armory was and provided most of the country, I should say the military, with its guns. If you take a look, you have the Potomac and the Susquehanna River coming together through here. And it can get dangerous at times. It's a very big recreational spot at this point in time. But right down here, as you see, this is the armory that produced the guns and stored them there for military use. And Brown was going to go there and start a slave revolt. The fort in the middle of the town was really not a fort. It was a storage facility. It later became a fire department. You see there for tourist purposes, it was called John Brown's Fort. John Brown and his men on an evening walk through the town, take a hostage, the mayor of the town. He is a descendant of George Washington and had the sword that Cornwallis surrendered at the Battle of Yorktown. So using the sword, they march the mayor and a few other hostages they have down to that fort and then demand their freedom as they're surrounded by the townspeople. They have the guns, they just need to distribute them to the slaves that they feel are going to rise up and save them. Well, of course, that's not going to happen. So there at Harper's Ferry, he becomes a national name. If you ever get a chance to go, it's a beautiful town. It sits up on the hill and at the confluence of those rivers that I showed you right there. It's also part of the Appalachian Trail if you ever want to walk the entire trail from south to north or vice versa. Anyway, word leaks out across the nation that this is taking place. Again, a slave revolt. Now, did any slaves take part in it? Just a couple who were runaways and Brown recruited up in Canada. He's got about 20 guys, many of them his sons and others. A United States Army colonel is sent to put down the revolt with some Marines. The Army colonel is a man by the name of Robert E. Lee, the former superintendent of West Point. Well, again, Brown is eventually going to be captured in October of 1859. He's going to be put on trial very soon after that, after Robert E. Lee takes over the fort. And Brown is going to be found guilty. But he says, I understand now that this great blot upon the nation's face can only be erased in blood. So he predicts the Civil War. Of course, he is found guilty of treason and will be executed. Now, Brown's future legacy, is it martyr or a madman? Which was he? As you see there, Ralph Waldo Emerson said he would make the gallows as glorious as the cross. Stephen Vincent Benet, another famous author, writes a 225-page poem extolling the values of John Brown. And again, you have the South pointing in the other direction and pointing out that here's a Northerner, and see what happens when we let them down here. Now, as you can see, this is what Harriet Tubman said upon Brown's execution. I've been studying and studying. It's clear to me that John Brown died on that gallows when I think how he gave up his life for our people. On the other hand, you have this man saying, an enthusiast broods over the oppression of people till he fancies himself commissioned by heaven to liberate them. He ventures the attempt which ends in little else than his own execution. And of course, that criticism comes from the future Republican presidential candidate, Abraham Lincoln. So you have a variety of things coming out of this.
John Brown was an important figure in American history.
Now we're going to skip John Brown here. Now, there's what the Richmond Enquirer paper said. The Harper's Ferry invasion has advanced the cause of disunion more than any other event that has happened since the formation of this government. So the stage is set for that man who secured the Republican nomination, and the convention was held in his home state, Chicago, Illinois. And some things were done, some favors that were granted. And as you see there, Lincoln will be elected. The Democratic Party splits into three parts. The Southern Democrats, where a man by the name of John Breckinridge from Kentucky is nominated. The Northern Democrats, Douglas is their candidate. And the Constitutional Union Party, by a man who eventually will become an officer in the Confederate Army. And of course, the South keeps saying, if this man, meaning Lincoln, is elected, then we will leave the Union. By this time, very few Republicans and very few people took this seriously. They had been crying wolf, the South, for a long, long time and done nothing. And as you see down there at the bottom, Seward, Secretary of State Seward under Lincoln, Seward, who thought that he was going to be the nominee of the party, said the South could no more unite upon a scheme of secession than a company of lunatics could aspire to break out of Bedlam. So again, a major mistake on the politicians' part, underestimating the South's desire to leave. Of course, Lincoln does get elected, and they start leaving the Union. Buchanan was still president until March. And at that, until that time, Lincoln could do nothing. And Buchanan did exactly the same thing. He did nothing. While all this is going on, Senator Crittenden of Kentucky tries to keep the South in the Union. As you see there, slavery would be prohibited north of 3630 as part of the Missouri Compromise. It would be protected the South of the line in present and future states, and the future state would be based on popular sovereignty. Lincoln says no to his people. Tell them, no, we're not going to do it. But in the meantime, an amendment to the Constitution is proposed, the Corwin Amendment. And it says, government cannot touch slavery in any state. The irony is this: if many Southern states had not left the Union, they would have had the votes to make this a law. And they would have achieved their ends without a shot being fired. As you can see on the numbers there, the states start to leave. Number one is South Carolina, and that is going to come back to haunt them. Number two, Mississippi, but notice the last of the 11 states. It's in the upper regions, Virginia, North Carolina, and Tennessee. And as you go with the color codes down here, you'll see that Tennessee, Eastern Tennessee, was not in favor of leaving at all. Western Virginia, which eventually, of course, becomes the state of West Virginia, was not in favor of leaving either. So secession was not universally looked upon with favor by all people in the South. And then, of course, you have slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and eventually West Virginia, who are slave states, but they are choosing to stay in the Union. So South Carolina leads the charge, as they have threatened always to do. Lincoln is on his way to be president. There are attempts to assassinate Lincoln. He's going to have to change trains in Philadelphia, a midnight rendezvous, if you will, in Philadelphia, so that he can avoid going through Baltimore, where the assassination is going to take place. In the meantime, this man, former United States Senator, and now the new Confederate States Vice President, Alexander Stephens, says this. This is in his famous cornerstone speech. I point this out because there will be many people that will argue that slavery was not the major cause of the Civil War. Nay, it wasn't even a cause. Well, this is what their vice president is saying. And one of the things that he points out that's not in that speech, he says, the United States government is flawed. and always has been, because it's founded upon the idea of human equality. Flawed because we are founded on the ideal of human equality. So that was the attitude that Lincoln was going to have to face when he takes office in March of 1861. So the causes of the Civil War: slavery, secession. Can you just leave? So what's the meaning of the Constitution? Loss of political power. The southern states who had dominated the federal government for so long no longer had that, as the population and the power shifted north and then west. Cultural differences. The stereotypes on both sides were what was emphasized, and people saw that they had little in common with one another, when in fact they did. The growing economic divide. The South will not be hit by the new market economy. They are stuck in an economy that was built shortly after the American Revolution. You have radicals like a John Brown, a Davis, who eventually becomes the president of the Confederacy, and others who are being listened to. And then all the incidents that we talked about, the Dred Scott decision, failed compromises, John Brown, and of course, Lincoln's election. All of these were going to lead to the Civil War. April 12th, 1861. First shots are fired and war has begun. We will take a look at that war and its impact on the United States.